Imagine a quiet autumn morning in the Sicilian port of Messina. The sun casts a soft glow over the harbor as fishermen haul in their catch. One fisherman looks up and spots sails on the horizon. Genoa's ship's just arriving. He wipes his hands, raises a hand, and waves, but no one waves back. Curious, he steps closer, boards one of the ships, and climbs the creaking stairs, calling out. Then the smell hits him. Thick, foul, unnatural. Bodies lie scattered like broken dolls.
Some are already dead.
Others barely move. Their skin blotched with black, their limbs swollen grotesquely. He staggers back, horrified. These ships have brought more than goods. They carry death itself. In the months to come, entire towns will vanish. Between 75 and 200 million lives will be lost. This is Black Death, the medieval plague that wiped out half of Europe. Before we follow death's dark journey westward, we must first understand the magnificent civilization it was about to encounter. The Europe of 1340 stood at the apex of medieval achievement, a continent brimming with confidence, prosperity, and unprecedented demographic growth. This was not the primitive dark ages of popular imagination, but a sophisticated society that had created some of humanity's most enduring achievements. The population of Europe had nearly tripled since the year 1000, reaching an estimated 75 million souls. Great cities thrived along trade routes. Paris housed perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, making it larger than any settlement Europe had known since the fall of Rome. The Gothic cathedrals rising skyward represented not just religious devotion, but the pinnacle of engineering achievement. Structures so magnificent that some contemporaries believed only divine intervention could explain their construction. Medieval Europeans believed they had the world figured out. The great thinkers of the age had created what seemed like a complete understanding of the cosmos. God's creation followed clear rules that human minds could grasp. Thomas Aquinas had recently woven together ancient Greek philosophy with Christian teaching, creating a framework that appeared to explain everything from the movements of stars to the purpose of human existence. Universities at Paris, Oxford, and Bologna attracted Europe's brightest minds, confident in their mastery of divine truth. Yet beneath this prosperity lay troubling vulnerabilities. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already demonstrated Europe's fragility as climate change and agricultural failures killed perhaps 10% of the population. More ominously, Europe's very success had created the conditions for its own devastation. Dense urban populations, extensive trade networks, and close human-animal contact in crowded cities. This was a civilization that had convinced itself it possessed answers to life's greatest questions, a dangerous confidence that would soon face its ultimate test. While Europe basked in its medieval golden age, in the vast steppes of Central Asia, death was stirring among the windswept mountains of what we now call Kyrgyzstan. Recent archaeological evidence has traced the origins of the Black Death to the Tian Shan Mountains, where ancient plague genomes revealed the birthplace of humanity's most devastating pandemic. Here, in the early decades of the 14th century, Unia pestis mutated into a form much more virulent to humans, transforming from a regional affliction of wild rodents into a world-conquering plague. The bacterium Unia pestis had been humanity's silent companion for millennia, lurking in the colonies of marmots, ground squirrels, and other rodents that dotted the Eurasian landscape. But something changed in those mountain valleys around 1338. Climate fluctuations, human encroachment, or perhaps simply the relentless mathematics of mutation created the perfect conditions for this microscopic predator to leap from its animal hosts into the bloodstream of human history. The plague's journey westward followed the same routes that had enriched civilizations for centuries, what we now call the Silk Road. Think of these ancient pathways as the medieval equivalent of today's internet. A vast network connecting distant corners of the known world. Just as our modern digital highways carry both beneficial information and computer viruses across continents in seconds, these trade routes served as arteries of both prosperity and pestilence. The very networks that had brought luxury goods, new ideas, and cultural exchange to countless cities would now become the pathways of their destruction. Consider the profound irony. The same interconnectedness that had allowed medieval civilization to flourish would now facilitate its near collapse. The plague originated in China in the early to mid-300s and spread along trade routes westward, following the ancient paths carved by human ambition and commerce, carried by merchants who had no idea they were transporting humanity's doom alongside their precious cargo. Mongol warriors and merchants moving between their scattered domains carried more than their traditional goods of horses, furs, and silver. The disease was taken to the Crimea by Mongol warriors and traders, where it would make its fateful leap into European consciousness. The great trading city of Kafir, modern-day Theodosia in Crimea, became ground zero for Europe's encounter with the plague. Here unfolds one of history's most grimly fascinating episodes. In 1346, during a siege of Kafir by Mongol forces, the plague struck the besieging army with devastating force. The Mongol commander, faced with the collapse of his forces, ordered the bodies of plague victims to be catapulted over the city walls, perhaps the first recorded instance of biological warfare. As one contemporary chronicler noted with horror, what seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa, witnessing the city's rapid descent into chaos, made the decision that would seal Europe's fate. They loaded their ships with whatever goods they could salvage and fled westward across the Black Sea, carrying with them the invisible passengers that would transform the medieval world. Those black rats in the ship's holds, their fleas heavy with Unia pestis, were about to become the unwitting agents of Europe's darkest hour. When those 12 Genoese galleys limped into the harbor of Messina in October 1347, the harbor master and townspeople who gathered to greet them encountered a scene from nightmares. Most of the sailors were already dead, their bodies sprawled across the decks. Those still alive were barely recognizable as human beings. Their skin blackened, their lymph nodes grotesquely swollen, blood and pus oozing from their orifices. The Sicilian authorities, recognizing the danger, but not understanding its true nature, ordered the ships to leave immediately. But it was already too late. The plague had found its foothold in Europe, and like water seeping through cracks in a dam, it would spread inexorably through every fissure of medieval society. Picture Maria, a young mother living near Messina's harbor. She watched those terrible ships arrive, saw the authorities turn them away, and probably felt relieved that the danger had passed. Within a week, her husband was dead. Within 2 weeks, her children. By month's end, Maria herself lay in one of the mass graves hastily dug outside the city walls. Her story multiplied by millions represents the human reality behind the statistics. From Sicily, the plague spread with mathematical precision, following the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world. By early 1348, it had reached the bustling ports of Genoa and Venice, the commercial hearts of medieval Europe. From there it advanced along the ancient Roman roads, up river valleys, and across mountain passes, transforming every pathway of human connection into a corridor of death. To understand the scale of what followed, we must abandon our modern conception of gradual change and imagine instead a world where catastrophe moved with the speed of rumor and the inevitability of tide. At least 1/3 of the European population, more than 25 million people, died between 1347 and 1352, though recent scholarship suggests the toll may have been even higher. In some regions, mortality approached 60%. Paris, the greatest city north of the Alps, became a chiral house. Contemporary chroniclers describe streets littered with corpses, churches overflowing with the dead, and the constant sound of church bells tolling for the departed until there were too few survivors to ring them. One Parisian priest wrote to his brother, "The city has become a tomb. We who remain walk among the dead, and know not if we shall join them by evening." The city's population may have fallen from 200,000 to fewer than 100,000 souls. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the collapse of everything he had known as civilized life. His account in the De Miran provides one of our most vivid glimpses into the plague's social destruction. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk, and the same night sped with their ancestors in the next world. Boeotia recorded how traditional burial rites collapsed entirely with bodies buried in mass graves like merchandise stowed in the hold of a ship. Imagine being that 13-year-old girl in Florence that Cassio might have known. Your family is gone. The streets are filled with corpses. The church bells that once marked the rhythm of daily life now ring constantly until there's no one left to ring them. You wander through neighborhoods where entire households have vanished, where doors hang open and gardens grow wild because there's no one left to tend them. This was the reality for thousands of children who survived the initial wave. Orphaned in a world that had forgotten how to care for the living, London suffered what medieval chroniclers called the Great Mortality, transforming the bustling commercial capital into a ghost town. The templates, normally crowded with merchant vessels, carried instead the bodies of plague victims downstream to the sea. Emergency burial grounds were established at East Smithfield, where archaeologists have uncovered mass graves containing thousands of plague victims, many showing signs of hasty burial and the characteristic lesions of bubonic plague. Perhaps most haunting are the accounts from smaller settlements, the villages and market towns that formed the backbone of medieval life. Here, the plague's impact was often total. Entire communities simply vanished, their fields returning to wilderness, their churches standing empty, their names surviving only in tax records and land grants. The village of Tusmore in Oxfordshire was completely abandoned, its population either dead or fled. The psychological impact proved almost as devastating as the physical toll. Traditional human bonds dissolved in the face of overwhelming mortality. Parents abandoned plague-stricken children. Spouses fled from infected partners, and priests refused to administer last rites. The Italian chronicler Matteo Villani observed that neither relatives nor friends could be found to take care of the sick or bury the dead. This wasn't mere cowardice. It was the complete breakdown of the social contract in the face of existential terror. Strange phenomena accompanied the plague's passage. Witnesses reported seeing mysterious figures in white robes walking through cities at night, marking doors with crosses to indicate future victims. A French chronicle records, many swore they saw Death himself walking the streets of Avignon, a tall figure in a dark cloak pointing at houses where the pestilence would strike. Foul odor preceded the plague's arrival in many towns. Smells so distinctive that survivors could predict an outbreak days before the first deaths occurred. Medieval physicians trained in the classical traditions that had guided healing for centuries found themselves utterly helpless before the plague's onslaught. Their carefully constructed understanding of disease crumbled when confronted with Yinia pestis. Think of it like modern doctors suddenly facing an alien pathogen that ignored everything they knew about medicine. Their expertise became not just useless, but dangerous as it gave false confidence. The plague manifested in 3 distinct forms, each more terrifying than the last. Bubonic plague, the most common form, announced itself through the appearance of buboes, swollen lymph nodes that could grow to the size of oranges, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. Contemporary chroniclers described the buboes as God's tokens, divine marks that foretold inevitable death. A physician in Montpellier wrote, "The swellings appear suddenly, hard as stones, burning with fever. When they burst, the stench fills the room, and death follows within days." Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs directly, causing victims to cough up blood and die within hours of showing symptoms. This form spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets. No fleas or rats required. Entire households could be wiped out in a single day when pneumonic plague took hold. Most feared of all was septic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. Victims of this form often died so quickly, sometimes within hours, that they showed few external symptoms beyond the characteristic blackening of extremities that gave the plague its popular name. This darkening of the skin created the terrifying spectacle of people who appeared to be rotting while still alive. Medieval physicians tried everything in their considerable arsenal. They prescribed complex mixtures of herbs, performed bloodletting to balance the body's humors, and burned aromatic substances to purify corrupted air. Some recommended drinking one's own urine. Others suggested the application of crushed emeralds or powdered unicorn horn, remedies that seem absurd to us, but represented the cutting edge of medieval medical knowledge. Theoriac, a legendary cure-all containing dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh, was prescribed at enormous expense. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of experimental cancer drugs, desperately expensive treatments that desperate people will try when conventional medicine fails. None of it worked. The failure of established medicine created a crisis that extended far beyond medical practice. If the learned physicians with their Latin texts and university training could not explain or cure the plague, what other certainties of medieval life might prove equally hollow? In a world where natural disasters were universally understood as expressions of divine will, the plague's unprecedented scale demanded equally unprecedented explanations. Medieval Christians struggled to comprehend what sin could have been so great as to warrant such punishment. Many concluded that humanity itself had grown so corrupt that God had decided to start anew, much as he had with Noah's flood. Flagellant movements swept across Europe with bands of penitents traveling from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares while calling for universal repentance. A German chronicler described these processions. They came singing hymns of death and redemption, their backs roar with self-inflicted wounds, calling upon all to repent before God's final judgment. These well-intentioned gatherings intended to appease divine wrath often became super-spreader events that carried the plague to previously unaffected communities. The search for scapegoats intensified as the death toll mounted. European Jews, already marginalized, found themselves blamed for the plague through grotesque conspiracy theories. Despite the obvious fact that Jews died from the plague at the same rates as Christians, rumors spread that they had poisoned wells or made pacts with devils to destroy Christendom. Entire Jewish communities were burned alive in Germany and France, their property seized by local authorities. This persecution revealed something disturbing about human nature under extreme stress: the tendency to prefer comprehensible evil to incomprehensible catastrophe. A Jewish conspiracy, however implausible, offered the illusion of human agency and control. It suggested that the plague had identifiable causes and could therefore be stopped through identifiable actions, even if those actions were themselves monstrous. Consider the testimony of a Jewish merchant from Strasbourg recorded before his community was destroyed. "We die as you die. We weep as you weep. Yet you call us the authors of this misery. What madness has seized the world that suffering seeks to multiply itself through hatred?" As mortality rates soared beyond anything in recorded history, the fundamental institutions of medieval society began to collapse under their own weight. The feudal system based on personal relationships between lord and vassal simply couldn't function when death claimed both parties with equal indifference. Entire noble lineages vanished overnight, leaving vast estates without clear inheritance. The Church, medieval Europe's most stable institution, found itself simultaneously overwhelmed with demand for its services and decimated by loss of personnel. Priests and monks who ministered to the dying and performed last rites died, at even higher rates than the general population. Entire monasteries were abandoned, their accumulated centuries of learning left to decay. Economic life ground nearly to a halt. Markets that had operated continuously since Roman times simply ceased to function. The complex web of credit, trade relationships, and manufacturing that had supported medieval prosperity unraveled as quickly as plague spread through a household. Italian banking houses that had financed kingdoms collapsed when their agents across Europe died faster than new ones could be trained. In many regions, the basic human duty to bury the dead became impossible to fulfill. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of every major city, and when these overflowed, bodies were simply burned in great pyres or left to rot where they fell. The sight of unburied dead, perhaps more than any other single factor, convinced survivors that the end times had truly arrived. Most tellingly, even fundamental social bonds, the ties between parent and child, husband and wife, dissolved under the pressure of absolute terror. Cassio recorded the unthinkable. Brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more and scarcely to be believed, Fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate, as if they had been strangers. When the plague finally began to recede in the early 1350s, not through any human intervention, but simply because it had killed so many potential hosts, the Europe that emerged was fundamentally transformed. The demographic catastrophe had shattered the old order so completely that restoration was impossible. Adaptation became the only option for survival. Labor, suddenly scarce after centuries of abundance, commanded unprecedented value. Surviving peasants found themselves in a position unthinkable before the plague. They could negotiate with their lords. A surviving English peasant's petition captures this transformation. "My lord, the fields lie, not for want of seed, but for want of hands. If you would have grain, you must offer more than custom demands." The Statute of Labours passed by the English Parliament in 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but economic reality proved stronger than legislative decree. The Church, having lost much of its personnel and faced profound questions about divine justice, underwent significant reform movements. People who had watched learned theologians die as helplessly as illiterate peasants began to seek direct spiritual experience rather than institutional mediation. Intellectually, the plague marked the beginning of the end for medieval confidence in absolute truth. If learned authorities could not explain or prevent such catastrophe, perhaps human knowledge required new foundations entirely. Art and literature became increasingly preoccupied with mortality. The Dance of Death became a popular artistic motif depicting skeletons, leading representatives of every social class, popes and peasants, kings and merchants in an eternal dance toward the grave. The plague also fundamentally altered European attitudes toward medicine, leading to increased emphasis on empirical observation over ancient texts. The Black Death shattered the belief that humans were somehow above nature's fury, revealing instead our place as biological creatures, subject to the same forces that govern all life on Earth. Yet, the story is not ultimately one of defeat, but of human resilience and adaptability. The Europe that emerged was smaller in population, but perhaps more dynamic, more questioning, more aware of both human limitations and possibilities. A survivor's letter from post-plague Paris captures this dual legacy. "We who remain are fewer, but perhaps wiser. We have seen the worst that fate can bring, and yet we still plant seeds for next year's harvest." If this is not hope, what is? Today, as we face our own global challenges, the Black Death offers both warning and inspiration. It reminds us that human civilization, for all its achievements, remains fragile. But it also demonstrates that societies can survive even the most catastrophic challenges, emerging transformed but not destroyed. The Black Death was indeed humanity's greatest reckoning with mortality. But it was also, in its aftermath, a revelation of humanity's greatest strength: the ability to continue, to adapt, and to build anew even after confronting the abyss.